By now, the federal bombardment had stopped and the rebels had emerged from their bunkers, ready to fight. They poured rifle and cannon fire into the Union skirmishers, and engineers stood ready to detonate buried landmines if the Union soldiers charged. Curtis decided to hold off on his assault until the next morning. Ames was getting cold feet about attacking the fort, and he began arguing with Curtis. The argument degenerated into a debate over how many sides the fort had. Although Fort Fisher only had 2 sides, the Union maps showed it to have 4. General Curtis remained in front of the fort, but after receiving a third order to withdraw, Curtis finally complied. There was more bad weather, and General Ames suspended the loading of troops, leaving Curtis and 600 men to spend the night on the beach. The next day, Butler's transports set sail, leaving General Curtis and his men stranded. Amazingly, Braxton Bragg did not order an attack on the stranded Federals, even though General Oak's 3,400 men had all arrived at Sugarloaf. It was not until December 27th that Curtis and his men were evacuated by the Union fleet. The first attack on Fort Fisher had been a miserable failure. Benjamin Butler was relieved of his command, and a new expedition was planned. The Confederates set about repairing the minor damage to the fort. On January 13th, the Union fleet returned. This time, Admiral Porter had 58 warships mounting 600 cannon and over 9,000 soldiers under the command of Major General Alfred Terry. The second attack on Fort Fisher was to be the largest American amphibious operation ever attempted. It would hold this record until the D-Day landings during World War II. Unlike the previous expedition, they decided to land troops before bombarding the fort. After a naval bombardment, the transports landed troops at Myrtle Sound, near Sugarloaf. This was an ideal spot for a landing. Even though Robert Oak's 6,400 men were returning to Sugarloaf, swamps, Myrtle Sound and the Union fleet prevented them from attacking. Meanwhile, the Union fleet's ironclads were engaged in an artillery duel with Fort Fisher. Unlike the previous battle, the ironclads focused on knocking out the fort's cannon. By the late afternoon, after all the Union troops were ashore, the rest of the Navy joined in on the bombardment. The fire was much more accurate than it had been in December. The ships began scoring direct hits on artillery emplacements inside the fort. The fort's gunners bravely fired back, but eventually the shelling drove most of them into the bunkers. That evening, the Union troops moved southwards, stopping at Battery Anderson the next morning. There they began to dig trenches and foxholes, in case the Confederates decided to attack from Sugarloaf. General Whiting sent repeated messages by telegraph to Braxton Bragg, asking him to attack. Bragg did nothing, thinking that the Union troops were too strong. Later in the day, he amazingly sent a transport filled with supplies to a wharf held by Union troops. As the ship pulled into the dock, unaware of the Union soldiers, she was sunk by the rebel gunboat CSS Chickamauga to keep the Union troops from capturing the supplies. On January 14th, the Union warships bombarded the fort all day. The fire was again deadly accurate. All but 3 or 4 cannon on the land face of the fort were knocked out, and 200 men were killed or wounded. All in all, the Union warships would fire 20,000 shells at Fort Fisher. The Union land forces under General Terry lost some men to the fort's guns and the gunboat Chickamauga, but they prepared to assault the fort the next day. However, Admiral Porter wanted a share in the ground assault, so a force of 2,200 sailors and marines was assigned to assault the fort's northeast bastion. For the rest of the 14th, sharpshooters from both sides exchanged fire while the Union troops prepared to attack. Bragg had still not reinforced the fort, and still did not attack the Union troops from Sugarloaf. Whiting and Lamb became convinced that Fort Fisher would fall. On the afternoon of January 15th, the sailors and marines charged across the open ground towards the fort. Most of these men had never fought together and were armed with only revolvers and cutlasses. Rifle and artillery fire from the few remaining cannon tore into their ranks. The battle turned into a mass slaughter, and most of the sailors turned and ran. Almost 300 men were killed in the assault. While the sailors were being mowed down by grape shot and rifle fire, General Terry had sent over 4,000 men to attack the fort around the Shepherd's Battery, which was defended by only 350 Confederates. The men charged down the Wilmington Road leading into the fort. Cannon and rifle fire tore into their ranks. Some of them became stuck in a swamp, making them easy targets for rebel sharpshooters. But they rushed onwards and began to scale the fort's walls. They began fighting hand-to-hand with the defenders, using bayonets, rifle butts and sabers. Other troops charged along the Wilmington Road next to the Shepherd's Battery towards the entrance to the fort, while the Confederates defended the road with 2 light cannons. The entrance to the fort became known as Bloody Gate, as Union troops tried in vain to get past the rebel defenders. But after capturing the Shepherd's Battery, the men attacked the Confederates from the rear and captured the gate. A seesaw battle over each battlement and bunker developed. After the Union troops had taken the first 3 gun emplacements, Confederate reinforcements, having just driven off the sailors, crashed into the battle. Colonel Lamb turned some of the fort's artillery onto the section held by the Federals and attempted to detonate the fort's landmines. But the Union bombardment had severed the wires and the mines did not explode. The Union fleet began shelling the land side of the fort, killing many Confederate defenders. Even General Whiting entered the battle and was shot in the leg. For a while, neither side made an advance, but in the end, overwhelming Union numbers pushed the Confederates back. Colonel Lamb rallied his men for another charge, only to fall wounded. Major James Riley took command of the Confederates, but he could not hold back the Union soldiers. Confederate officers were not the only ones who went down. Union General Martin Curtis, who also fought during the first battle, was wounded 5 times, and the 5th wound forced him to leave the fight. By then, Union troops held 7 of the land face's 16 gun emplacements. By 5:30 p.m., firing slowed as night fell. This allowed General Terry to rush reinforcements to the fort. At 9 o'clock that night, the battle was renewed. Union reinforcements stormed the next emplacement, while another unit snuck around to the sea face of the fort and scaled the walls there, firing on the rebels from behind. This action surrounded the northeast bastion, and many Confederates were captured attempting to escape. Major Riley now had only a handful of men left, and retreated to Battery Buchanan. After looking over his 500 remaining men, most of whom had no weapons, Major Riley decided there was nothing more he could do, and surrendered at 10 o'clock that night. Fort Fisher had fallen. The Union had lost 1,500 killed, the Confederates 500. After the capture of the fort, disaster struck. Union soldiers celebrated their victory all night, drinking and partying. One band of Marines took lit torches into the fort's main gunpowder magazine, and the entire store of 13,000 pounds of gunpowder exploded. The blast killed over 200 Union soldiers and Confederate prisoners. The next day, other explosions took place across the river. Braxton Bragg ordered a retreat from the forts at Old Inlet. Fort Caswell was blown up by 100,000 pounds of gunpowder. It is said that the explosion was heard in Fayetteville, 90 miles away. Supplies at the forts were burned, and the Confederates retreated to Fort Anderson, across from Sugarloaf. Union troops quickly took control of the area and occupied the town of Smithville.